Too bad you couldn't see our studio. It's amazing.
Well, we'll see it on Tuesday, right?
Yeah. It's,
Hi, everyone. My name is Prairie Rose Seminole. I'm the program manager for Advanced Native Political Leadership, and we are joined this week by the editor of Indian Country Today, Mark Trahant. I have gotten to know Mark over the last few years because of our election work and his eye for good story. Mark is a previously independent journalist, but now the editor for Indian Country Today. Welcome, Mark. We appreciate you being here today.
Thank you, sir. It was always delightful. Delighted to be here.
So 2020, it's been quite a year for stories and all kinds of issues, but this electoral landscape, what are some of the highlights so far this year that you're paying attention to?
I think probably start with the sheer volume. We're tracking 110 candidates, ranging from county commission all the way up through state legislatures to 14 candidates for Congress, including one United States Senate seat and the rest U.S. House seats. What's really cool about this group of congressional races is we have two different districts where Native candidates are on both sides of the ballot. So you have Republican Native versus a Democrat Native, and in Hawaii, you actually have Democrat Native, Republican Native, and Independent Native Party Native.
Wow, that's incredible. I feel like we don't hear that very often because we're still talking about the first, right? We're still talking about the first, legislative candidate and the first council candidate. All these things outside of tribal politics. I was like not prepared to hear. We're running against each other now, which is a good sign, I think.
I think it's a great sign, absolutely. And that actually, the last cycle that happened a couple times. I mean, I think the most extraordinary one was in Minnesota with two candidates for lieutenant governor. So you couldn't lose.
I do remember that. Do you feel that the candidates across the board have, a unique perspective being, well, they do have a unique perspective being indigenous, but do you feel that they bring value to the seats that they're running for in a way that their non-white counterparts are?
They do in a couple of ways, Prairie Rose. I think probably, to me, the most important thing is when a Native person runs, particularly in a rural district, it changes people's perception of Native people forever. So instead of being an issue about mascots or about protests or about the local casino or kind of the stories that we all fall into over and over and over, suddenly they're seeing a Native person who's a professional, who's asking for their vote, who's telling stories that connect to a larger audience. And over time, I think that's really powerful because it makes us be less the other and more the mainstream.
Yeah, I agree with that. I appreciate that perspective as well. Why, well, let's talk a little bit about you though. How did you get into this work and paying attention to the political landscape and candidates?
Sure, I started with spreadsheets. Probably about a dozen years ago, I realized that nobody was keeping track of Native candidates. And so I started spreadsheets and started building that. This year is really interesting for me because this is the first year where I haven't done the reporting myself. I'm working with a lot of younger reporters, people at Indian Country Today, and it means we have a lot more resources, but it also means I get to spend less time with the candidates and doing some of the groundwork that I used to love to do. And that's just the nature of growth. I remember actually several years ago out with a candidate and we were traveling, we went to a powwow and it was a Saturday. And I remember asking her, what are you doing on Sunday? And she said, I'm in the call room all day. That moment, I knew she was serious about it because you have to make the phone calls. And I think that's one of the most important stories is you see the candidates out there who are willing to do the work. And some of it's not glamorous. It's not being out front of an audience. It's not shaking hands with people you like. It's one, going to places where you don't like the people, and two, sitting down and making phone calls and saying, I need to raise X million dollars. This cycle, Native candidates have raised an extraordinary amount of money. They've done really well. In Idaho, for example, both Rudy Soto, who's running for the US House, and Paulette Jordan, who's running for the United States Senate, Paulette raised $1 million last quarter. That's a lot of phone calls. Think about it. Rudy Soto raised more than his Republican challenger.
It's incredible. I feel that's a real testimony to the growth happening across Indian country, is that there is this realization happening with candidates that they have to do the work. I think of a lot of candidates that have come through my region in the Dakotas who ran for the sake of running, just so the party could have a candidate. And when we ask people, what's your platform on, you know, what's your position on healthcare, or what's your position on extractive industries, and what's your, you know, the various positions that they could have on a multitude of issues, and they didn't really have an answer. And then we'd ask them about their field plan, because that's my background, is working field and getting out, you know, not just votes, but you know, turning out all kinds of resources. But the reality of candidates not investing in that portion of their campaign, whether it's time or talent or money from others, they're not willing to put the work, and therefore the win might not matter as much. So it's a real testament to wanting the win and wanting to build political power is, yeah, what you're saying, do the work.
And I mean, it's not exactly an art. It really is a series of blocks that you do: step A, step B, step C. And I remember Denise Juneau, who's a MHA tribal citizen, and she ran for Congress in Montana. And at the end of that, she said, you know what? I raised the money. I went where I was supposed to. I did the work, and I lost. I got beat. I don't feel bad. And I think that's really the right attitude, is that you do the work, and then you see what happens.
I agree. I absolutely agree. If you can't, at the end of the day, election night, sit there exhausted, knowing that you've done everything that you can, made all the phone calls, knocked on all the doors, raised as much money as you possibly could, and spent that money in the best ways possible to further, you know, your candidacy and the people you're representing. Yeah, you can sit down and say, I did the best I could, you know, for real. Oh. Where are you at now? Where are you located and races that you're paying attention to locally?
We are based at the Walter Cronkite School at Arizona State University in downtown Phoenix, although we haven't been using the newsroom since March, like so many people. And we, crazy us, decided to launch a daily news show during a pandemic. And our planning had all been for a weekly. But when the pandemic hit, we started doing these Zoom calls and noticed what kind of audiences we were getting. And pretty soon, a couple of television networks said, we'd love to carry this. And before we knew it, we had a daily show, and now we're trying to fund it and make it work. Right. But as part of that, when we first started, we were doing it out of people's living rooms. And we realized we needed to get into a studio of some kind, but we needed to make it safe. And eventually the solution we came up with is we moved into the Phoenix Indian School Visitor Center, and we're repurposing that. And I love that as a metaphor to take, you think about in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, the idea of a boarding school was to take folks from Indian country, put them in a narrow channel and say, that's all you can do. And here we're going into that narrow channel and blowing away the walls and saying, no, we're not going to run the printing presses. We're going to decide what's on the printing presses. We're not going to run the television station. We are the television station. And I think that shift of metaphor is really powerful. So I love being there in that sense.
I agree with you. I think the boarding school era has been one of the most disastrous, you know, to our ways of life and our culture, our language, etc. However, to take that and to reclaim that this space that was used to oppress us and to give us a voice and to bring more voices into that space and define it. I think that's beautiful. You know, it's part of the healing. It's healing all of those beings that came through there, for sure.
We've been using the studio since March, well, the last few months, but for election night, we'll have a nationwide broadcast starting at 8 o'clock Mountain Time on election night. And we took the studio and took it up. We now have Studio A, Studio B. We designed it so there will only be 10 people in the building, and everyone will be socially distanced and in and out. And it's really interesting how we've been able to create this. And we will reach on election night, no matter, I don't know how many people will turn us on because we can't measure that, but the household reach is 75 million. And that's really, we're going to, in cities like Chicago and Denver and New York City, statewide in Alaska, statewide in New Mexico, Arizona PBS, the potential for creating this new news network where people go on and do stories with our unique lens rather than wait for someone else to tell those stories.
Yeah, there's such a need for us to see ourselves right now. And I think there's a hunger from everyone else to also have this voice brought into these spaces. And you're doing it. Tell us, actually, I don't know if a lot of our listeners and viewers are aware of Indian Country Today in the story that has how it's come to be. You kind of took it over in a position when it might not have survived, but it seems to be the kind of this phoenix rising from this place that you grasped it from.
We had quite a run. So Indian Country Today was actually started as Lakota Times, and it was a newspaper at Pine Ridge for its first 10 years. The owner then, Tim Geigo, wanted to go national, and his first vision was he actually worked with printers in Albuquerque, and they printed 2 editions, one in Pine Ridge and one in Albuquerque, and it became Indian Country Today. He then sold it to the Oneida Nation, and for the next 25 years, they ran it from New York City and then Oneida. And about 4 years ago, they decided they couldn't do it anymore. It was losing too much money, and they pulled the plug, and they did it very quickly. I mean, it just ended. And then they gave the assets to the National Congress of American Indians. They called and said, will you try to bring this back to life? And I think they were thinking of a small little newsletter with a couple people. And of course, I ignored all that. And we started with 3 people. And now, last count, we have 20 full-time employees. And our goal is to double that in the next year, particularly with this broadcast. What I really like is we're getting a mix of people who have been professionals for a long time, folks like Marionette Pember, who've been writing really for 30, 40 years. And then folks like Aaliyah Chavez, who just graduated from Stanford. I mean, literally, it's her first job. And she's doing really great work. And I love that mix of young people and older professionals. One of the things that's been a payoff in that is our number 1 demographic is 25 to 34, which is really rare in the news business. I mean, most people, it's skews much older. And so I think that really shows that this connection we're making is different and profound.
Yeah, I know, I see it. It's much more visible, and where you all have taken this, especially 4 years ago, social media was still relatively new to older generations, and that 25 to 35-year-old demographic had been kind of growing up into it. So I think you've found yourself a niche that will grow with that same population, as well as encourage and incite more engagement from the younger demographic as well. So good luck with that. I'm excited to watch you all grow. Like, this is just exciting to be a witness and like have your cell phone number in my phone and be all like, Mark, this is incredible. I love what you guys are doing.
Well, it's not quite final, so I probably shouldn't say this on a public forum, but I'm pretty sure we're going to be on Prairie Public starting in January. And nice. So you'll be able to watch us every day in North Dakota.
Oh, that would be so cool. I know I was fortunate to be on the show not too long ago with some of the work that we're doing in North Dakota. And I want to get back to this political landscape and the stories that you're telling, I feel are very important, because we've been disengaged for such a long time from the political landscape and engagement on a level that's seeing us as more than just voters. You know, I think of, and I've said this before, maybe to you and Janie, where, you know, my father's generation, they didn't get to vote for most of their lives, and here we are trying to get people to participate and engage, and not just engage as voters, but engage as organizers and strategists and candidates and leaders, and making decisions at tables that affect our lives as Indigenous people in this country, when for so long we couldn't, right? And it's a system that doesn't often work for us. And how are you, and the work that you're all doing, how are you looking to engage people in the political landscape? Like, what is important for you to express to individuals who may not have been a part of it, may not want to be a part of it, but to engage them in some level, to say, hey, this is personal. Hopefully I'm not putting words in your mouth, but but to get them involved in the work.
Yeah, I think the challenge for us is to connect public policy to stories that connect to people, and to do it in a way to show that it's not just an idea that's abstract, but something that's significant. One that I've been grappling with a lot, and I think we're probably going to have to ratchet up in the next year or two, is we think about how we've covered COVID, and I'm really proud of the way we've covered COVID, but that's just the warm up. COVID is not the issue. Climate change is 10 times that. And whether it's disease or lack of water or really resource extraction changes, climate change is going to make us all rethink everything we do. And I think the more that we can prepare for that and help readers understand the connection between those policies that may seem abstract to real things that happen soon. I mean, much sooner than anyone ever expected.
Well, I mean, recently this administration just opened up the Tongass National Forest to extraction, and that's like the lungs of North America, right? So the issues are personal, because the president can approve a pipeline, Congress approves, you know, these other administrative pieces that continue to serve the extractive industries and our own economies, right? So if we're putting people first, or we're putting, you know, corporations first, that all depends on who we're voting for and who we're putting into those positions of power. I mean, it's a personal thing for me when it comes to our healthcare and our economy and our environment and all of these pieces. But what you're doing, humanizing those policy pieces, and telling the story, and then connecting the dots, saying, this is who makes the decisions. Now, how are we going to affect those decisions, right? It can start with our vote, right? It can start with our vote, but we need to build political power in another way.
And I think part of that is helping people think through the mechanics of democracy and how bad we are in the United States at it. We take for granted so many things that the rest of the world looks at us and says, what are you doing? And one that, I mean, people think about the Electoral College, and that's certainly a problem, but it's not nearly as big a problem as the United States Senate or the House of Representatives, the way it's elected. We choose people based on a system called first past the post, which means that you can win with just 40% or 35% of the vote. That idea that allows this entrenched minority to run things is really something that's hit our people hard. And you look at a state like Wyoming, and a vote in Wyoming is worth 33 times more than a vote in California. And then you look at how tribes and most tribal people think. We're much closer aligned politically with people in cities and people doing things in the areas that have lost that franchise. And so how we structure governance going forward, I think, is going to be one of the real great American challenges if we're going to get this right. There was this crazy meeting, or not crazy meeting, but when Donald Trump got elected, a group of people had a meeting in Phoenix, and they called me up and said, Mark, we want you to come and talk and be as wild and outrageous as you possibly can. We want to hear thinking that's going to make us think and go to the out extreme. And I ended up giving a talk about the end of the United States. And the thought was that we have 10,000s of years of history. And if the United States goes away, we're not going away. And what structure are we going to be ready for in that next environment? When I gave that talk, there was no thought about the United States evaporating. But now you could see how one state could cause that. Donald Trump could send troops to Oregon. Oregon says we succeed. And you suddenly got a very different look. And I think we need to think through very carefully how tribes fit into whatever comes next, because our sovereign ground needs to remain so, no matter what surrounds us.
I absolutely agree with that. I mean, we have an administration that has challenged our sovereignty, has reinstated termination policies. I mean, we've talked about this before, and now putting up our public lands, not just tribal like nations. This is like America's public lands open for resource extraction, and the public we need to stand up and we need to get involved. Yeah, I love talking with you. I'm wondering, on your journey as an independent journalist and I would even say historian for Indians. I don't even know what would you call it? The political electorate in Indian country. I don't know. That seems really academic.
Let's pretend academic.
Right. I am getting more and more academically conscious, but this idea of voter confidence, right? I battle it all the time across the country, even in my home area here of White Shield, North Dakota, around just that disengagement or even apathy around politics outside of tribal government. And how do you meet that? I mean, personally, not just with Indian Country Today, and absolutely go in that road. I think you have actually, in humanizing and personalizing policy in a way that people get it using our own narratives. But let's talk about that voter confidence. Is that something that we can mend, or are we mending it? Do you feel that's something that's growing? Or are numbers out there saying that there are more Native voters getting involved and doing it because it's the right thing to do, or doing it because there's a movement now?
So this gets into a complicated, almost academic topic of duality, where you have to think about two competing ideas at once. And on one side, we need to do everything we can to increase participation and to do well with the system that's in place. And I think tribes and citizens are doing that in really remarkable ways. I think this election, we're going to show a really strong turnout across the country. On the other hand, and this duality part, is we also need to press for a system that's more fair. The system we have is not working. It's not good. There's no way we can game it permanently. It's something we have to completely restructure. And we have to do both of those at the same time, even though they're very different ideas. And I think that's something that is hard to explain. But then again, if you look at countries around the world that have solid indigenous representation, one, they've already gone through this process of rethinking how everyone has a say in society. And two, they've made indigenous representation part of the deal. And I think if we can get there, we can go a long way. Now, it turns out that a lot of treaties, or at least some treaties, had provisions for that more than a century ago. The Chickasaw Treaty, for example, has a delegate to Congress in the treaty document, and Congress has never followed through on it. I think we need to press on those kinds of things and say, representation's great. We should press for that, but we should also have delegates in Congress based on tribal nation status directly. And again, if you look at the world, like New Zealand and some of the other places that have indigenous representation, that's the system that works best, where you have both elected and appointed serving together and finding a way to work together.
I'm a fan of that. I've been in appointed leadership for, a good part of 20 years, and I think it's been a benefit not just to my own leadership, but to serve the communities that I've served in the organizations and institutions that I've served within, to better relations. I think it's part of our restorative practices when we talk about building community with one another and restoring relationships and trust with one another. I think you're right that the issues of duality are very present for Indigenous people to become engaged in a political system and an electoral process that has never worked for us. And I put on my hopeful reformer hat, thinking that, well, if there's enough of us charging forward, it will work for us because we will get there. But we need all those other layers moving with us just as much.
Well, and last year is a good example. Last cycle, we doubled the number of Native representation in Congress, elected the first 2 women in history, and that brought us up to 0.66%. It was great. I'm glad we did it, but we got a long ways to go. Even if we were talking parity, we're talking 2%, and that would be 7 members of Congress or 8. And it just shows how much that length has to change.
Yeah. Gosh, our time is going by so fast. So there's 5 days to the election. What are you telling people? Why do our votes matter?
Well, our votes can matter because, well, first of all, there are 7 states where the Native vote could play a huge role in who wins the presidency. So start with that. I mean, Arizona is a great example of that. This was considered a safe seat for Republicans. It's no longer a safe seat. It's going to be in play. The Native vote, particularly the Navajo vote, will have a huge determinant on who wins the state. Same with the Senate seats across the country. Montana would be a good example of that. That seat could very well be determined by the Native vote. Colorado could be close in that regard. North Carolina, and that's not a state you generally think of with Native vote, but that could determine both the Senate and the presidency.
I don't think people know that. I mean, that's 15 electoral college votes right there with North Carolina, and no Republican president has won the presidency without North Carolina. So North Carolina is huge in a swing state right now.
Exactly. And so much so that, I mean, you saw President Trump campaigning. I mean, very much trying to reach out to that constituency.
Yeah, Alaska is now a battleground state, which I think you were the one who told me. I think Alaska Natives are 11% of the vote. 11%. Yeah, and the unique perspective of there is like they have a lot of young folks that can vote now, and the Generation Z in Indian country, well, across the country is equal to baby boomers, but within Indian country, that's a lot of our populations right there. Our younger folks getting out to vote and being involved right now.
And I think the story this cycle that's even better than voting, and voting is good on its own, but the other story that I think is really interesting is how connected they have made Indian country through social media. This new generation sees in the Indigenous world as always being one, and they have signals and communication in ways that other generations have only dreamed about.
I absolutely agree with that. Oh, I totally interrupted you. So you're getting to why our votes matter.
Well, and so from the House to the presidency, we can make a difference. So one story that I like about how our votes matter is I've always thought Montana was an example of a state that folks can get it right in. And one of the things that happened in Montana was first folks worked through the redistricting system. And that shows you how important structures are, because they basically worked very hard to get districts that would favor Indian candidates. And that did great things. A good group got into the legislature. Very first thing they did was a program called Montana Indian Education for All. And it said that every Montanan, in order to be a good citizen, should have a basic understanding of Indian history and policy. And that one thing got people to think differently about tribes in the state. And what's cool about the way Montana has evolved since those first few elections that were all native districts is then you start with that. And then the next round, people say, well, hell, I'm going to run in Missoula. I'm going to run in Billings. I'm going to run. And the result of that is you have a state that has parity. About 7% of Montana is native, and about 7% of the legislature is native. And that came around, again, it goes back to those building blocks. Start with the districting, build it up, look for rural districts, then look for urban districts, and bring them together until you can get representation. And they've used their voice pretty effectively. And it's been bipartisan. It's been really smart in that regard.
You brought up something that is key to that restorative practice, though, in building relationships and building trust, and especially when it comes to kind of the water we live in, this ecosystem in which we all thrive in, is the education at the school level, for people to understand tribal nations and how we came to be and how we are today, why we are today, in the way that we are today, if that makes sense. But that's important, because if there's so many people that I run into that don't understand treaties, that don't understand why we have, a unique political class as a people, and protected rights. So that, I feel, is one important step that a lot of states can do to improve relations and see, better turnout for engagement when it comes to a Native candidate running.
Mm-hmm. And it really is a weakness in what it means to be an American, aside from being connected to tribes and understanding tribes. You cannot understand American history if you don't understand that when treaties were negotiated, it was because the United States needed that. It wasn't the tribes that needed that. It was the United States that needed that legitimacy around the world. And by dealing with tribal nations, they were able then to take that and go to Europe and go to other places with legitimate governance. And we lent them that sovereignty, and maybe now we want it back.
Well, they didn't come to their end of the deal, so I think there's a time for land back and understanding that we are still here, because they also had a plan to wipe us all out. So we are still here, and we can fight for all this. I know we only have some short amount of time left to talk, but is there anything that you're looking forward to on election night, or things that you want to highlight for us to pay attention to as we move forward into one of the most important, if not the most important, election of at least my lifetime, and many others?
Absolutely. Well, a couple of things. One, I even think that phrase, the most important election, is important, but I think it's also, and then get back to duality, to remember that we build stories on stories, and that this election is a result of elections in the past, and they kind of all come together over and over. Helen Peterson was Ogallala, and I remember she wrote a piece for the American Political Science Association in 1948, talking about the Native vote and the power of the Native vote. And she was looking at different races. And back then, when folks were just getting the franchise secure, there were communities that had 100% registration and 100% turnout. And you think about what that could do today if you had places where the whole community came together and said, this is so important, we're going to make it a community thing, and we're going to hit this target, and we're going to hit this target, and we're going to show the impact. One of the screwy things is that we get excited in presidential elections, and our turnout will be really high in presidential elections. And the screwy thing there is that we'd have far more impact in primary elections in the middle of June when no one's even watching. Because if every Native person voted, we'd be like 30% of the electorate, maybe 40%, whereas now we're going to be 2 or 3. And taking advantage of those strategic opportunities with voting, I think, would be really cool at some point. What I'll be watching for is early returns. I think this time around, I mean, we did planning for a couple of things. One, we planned on a night where we know nothing. And watch returns come in during what we call election week and see if there's a result that way. The second scenario is that we know a lot quick. Florida actually processes ballots for early vote before they process the votes on Tuesday. So we'll get a good look at Florida very, very early. And Florida is one of those states where if it's one-sided, it's going to change the conversation for the rest of the night. One caution there is, so there was a blue wave 2 years ago. On election night, nobody knew there was a blue wave. It was the next day and the day after and the day after that people knew it was a blue wave. And that's because the race in Arizona hadn't been called. The race, several other races hadn't been called yet. And we didn't really see how significant it was for a couple of days. So with the changing way we vote, being patient is going to be really important.
That's key right there. Are we, are there, do you, I don't even know if I know this, but are those election results, are we going to have to wait? Are we waiting in states to finalize that count, or do you feel things are going to be rushed in certain areas? I think California is the only one I know that has extended that count, I think 17 days, something like that, to ensure that every vote is counted. I mean, that's what democracy looks like, folks, is taking the time we need to take to make sure that every vote is counted. But what are you seeing from your perch of the world?
Yeah, it's going to be different depending on states. Right now, there's a court battle in Minnesota about whether or not to count those last votes. And that one's particularly egregious because everybody was told this is the rules. And now an appellate court has said, no, these aren't the rules. We're going to make them up as we go along. And that's really dangerous and undermines the whole process. I think we're going to have to be vigilant about making sure that people have access to the polls, and not just that they can vote, but that their vote counts. And that's going to be a long battle going forward.
Yeah. Well, we have to wrap up here soon. Are there closing remarks that you want to share with our viewers? And we are looking forward to meeting with you after the election as well to talk about highlights and stories and other narratives that have come out from the results.
Well, be sure to watch our election coverage. It'll be on Facebook. It'll be on First Nations Experience, which is on in many markets across the country, Arizona PBS, and then our website, IndianCountryToday.com. I think we put together a really good team. We've got arrangements for many of the candidates to Zoom in, so we'll have really good access there. And I think people will find it, first of all, it's just cool to have that prism of this is what's important. How come no one's ever covered it before? And one thing I just loved is I was speaking actually at Native Governance 2 years ago after Election Day, and a young woman came up to me who had been watching the election night coverage and said, this is the first time in my life that the news was for me. Wow. And I really love that. And
yeah, I just appreciate you, Mark, so much. Just your wisdom that you bring forward, the narrative that you bring into Indian country today. I so appreciate a media outlet that's centering our experience as Indigenous people, lifting up our voices, stories that tell us, why politics exists and even what's politically possible. Like you're bringing all of that to us with your team and the work that you were doing. So we greatly appreciate your time. I look forward to seeing you after the election night. Till then, I hope you voted already. Vote early. Oh, good. Make sure your ballot's counted. But looking forward to election night coverage with you and your team. Get some rest, and hopefully you're well rested by Friday, the next time we talk with you. Appreciate your time, Mark.
Thank you, Rose.
Thank you, everybody, and catch us next week, Friday, 6 p.m. Central, 7 p.m. Eastern time. Thanks so much, everybody. Bye.